Yeah, now we are live. Okay.
Yeah, it's on live. Sorry, active speaker mode?
Yeah.
No, I was looking it up. It's just the studio mode. That's about it.
Hey, no, there was active speaker mode on mine.
No,
I'll
there's
just check that.
Yeah, there is. There definitely is an active speaker.
One second.
mode.
Has Anup sir gone off or am I not seeing him?
Anup sir is there.
we-
He's muted and switched off his video, which is fine. And let's just
Right.
wait for
We'll wait
Twila.
for the rest of them.
Back
Yeah.
again.
And so we're streaming live now on YouTube, guys. Can you see it?
Yes, we can. Let me just
I'll
check
just
the link.
try.
Right.
I'll just put up the link on Insta also.
Yeah,
yeah.
put up the link on Insta and just a minute. So I'll copy this link. Okay.
You're expecting a lot more people to join in, or how is it?
So we have around 70 registrations for this.
Okay.
So and the limit is 100. So we just hope. I mean, yesterday also we had 50 people, but the discussion went on for a lot longer than expected. So I mean, people did it at some point, but it was down to 27 or something like that towards the end.
And we are clocking it for an hour, or will we?
I think we will definitely try to do that today. Maximum 1 hour, 10 minutes. Everybody's. I mean, it depends. I mean, on you guys, of course. I mean, if you guys want to continue the chat, you can always accommodate. Nobody has to go anywhere.
Okay, cool.
Nobody has to go.
We are recording. We are live on.
Where's Aishwarya?
Can you hear my fan?
Okay. A bit. It's
Um,
okay. YouTube, we're live right now. Our faces are on it.
Excellent.
Yes, I know. I just did it. Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Sorry, guys. We can just.
Is it? Yeah, if anybody is not able to sort of join. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. I'm Aishwarya
Yeah.
and Monica. I'm going to
Yeah.
focus on putting stuff out on Insta
Okay.
and LinkedIn.
Yeah, don't
So-
worry. Anyway,
Right. One more thing. Once we're done, Aishu, so once we're done with all of this, in conclusion, you'll come on for the conclusion, right?
Sure,
And
sure.
then,
and I'll ask a question
and
also. I mean, I have for all of them. So.
yeah, and then we'll move into the
Let-
Q&As after that.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday a lot of Q&A started coming towards the end, which is kind of sad because we started running out of time. So let's just like in our chats with the
Right.
attendees, put it out there today.
Yeah.
Questions as in when you do, but the sooner the better. That's all.
Right. So that's why I'm saying maybe 10 minutes per speaker or like a little bit more than that, whatever is.
10 is
fine.
okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I think it was a discussion that took a long time. And then even while they were answering questions, they just were so passionate. And we are live about this. Why are we discussing yesterday's session right now? We are online. And there's Anup sir right there.
Right. Okay.
Is the lockdown going to be extended?
It looks like, right? I think in Karnataka we will do 31st. It looks like.
So we can't.
It was in the papers today.
Okay.
But do you think post 31st also we might have a second phase of lockdowns? So
It looks like they will release it in pockets, and I think the red zones will still hold on for a while.
Right.
I think for Bangalore, it's unpredictable because we were still in the red zone from their reading.
Yeah.
It would be probably Bangalore urban, Mysore, Gulbarga. I think three places. Mangalore, South Kendra. Mangalore urban. I think Mangalore urban will be on lockdown.
Okay.
And Mysore. Yeah, Mysore is also on the list.
Wow.
I live in Bangalore rural, so it should be okay. Near Devanapalli. But where am I to go anyway? It's like, sir, is Hebbal is also Bangalore urban only, no? Hebbal, Hennur.
Yeah. All of that is urban.
Yeah, not like I want to go somewhere, but it would be, I don't know, it's ambivalent. I mean, I feel much safer that the police and the health department, all of them they kept coming home for regular checkups and all that because I had traveled from the UK. They had stamped me. They were taking signatures in a million places. So it seems like, yeah, they're doing their best, but at the same time, it feels like, okay.
It's just that?
It feels a little weird because you're at the center of I mean, they could take you anytime. Allergies, right? Seasonal allergies. So what if one day they come and I'm like sneezing and they're like, oh my God, you have coronavirus. So now come with us to the isolation facility. Who knows? So, but all of that is over. Okay. Have you been using a lot of Zoom, sir, of late for your meetings and everything?
No, we've been continuously on it. Classes are also going on that way.
Oh yeah.
So
even our junior.
Yeah, we have.
But is Zoom
everything.
really unsafe? I mean, that's what's. I mean, there are so many,
in the
claims
digital
that
world,
NASA and Google have banned.
Anything can be unsafe because if you want to pick up data, you can pick it up anywhere, unless your firewalls are really strong.
Right.
Do you know anyone who's been in contact with it, sir? I haven't met anyone who knows someone who has it.
Oh, I do. 2 people from my cohort in my college, they were tested positive, but they got tested positive once they moved back to America.
Okay.
Wait, that's what
I think this is a critical phase now. I'm saying as long as they can prevent community spread, this is the golden period. And post which is when they actually restart again. If they're not careful enough, we'll be in trouble further.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Professor Paddy.
Good afternoon, sir.
Hi.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
So join us on such a short notice. Actually, we didn't anticipate this though. I mean, we thought, okay, we'll send him an invitation. Maybe he'll accept. Maybe he won't. But thank you so much.
That's all right.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I don't usually use LinkedIn very much. I just occasionally look at it, So I saw you. I know you'd sent me a message as well to my UCL email, but anyway, yeah, I'm pleased to do it. No problem.
And the summertime, springtime, we don't really have that in India, so it was really confusing, and it literally happened after I sent it, so it was just a small mix-up, I guess. Now we're all here. We can start the minute the other two.
Yeah. Where are you in India? You're in Bangalore?
Yes, so we're all.
Yes, we're all in Bangalore.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Where are you, sir, currently? Are you in London?
Yeah, I'm in London. Well, we're all locked down, you know, so if we can't move, we can't leave the house. I mean, in our case, by age groups, we're in the vulnerable population because we're over 70, you know, 70 and over. And basically, we have to stay in for 12 weeks, basically. That's the government mandate. And we're about 3 weeks in, basically. It might be relaxed, you know what I mean? Sort of when the epidemic peaks and begins to decline. But it's a big problem, very big problem. There's no buses. I mean, there are buses and trains running, but there's nobody on them, you know? So there's a skeleton service, basically, in the UK.
I was in London until recently as well. I actually flew back to India on 17th of March. And,
Oh, really? Okay, yeah.
I'm studying at Goldsmiths, doing a master's in neuroaesthetics. Actually,
All right. Okay. Yeah.
I started getting really paranoid when we heard that a Jubilee line train driver got sick and he was tested. Okay, this is moving very close to me. So I just thought, fly back home.
Yeah.
Hello, hi, Twila.
Hi, Twila.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Twila.
The audio is still connecting. Okay. This is exactly why we had to sort of meet before.
Start beforehand to test audio.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Maria.
Hi, Twila.
Hi, Anu.
There's an interesting bunch of portraits behind you.
Yes, I prepared this for the talk.
That is so interesting.
Do you want to try sharing your screen before we start?
Yeah, let me try.
You can just like works and everything.
Could you try to make it full screen? I think we had a small problem with that yesterday.
Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
perfect. It works. Yeah, I think we can go back to Monica's screen now. You'll have
Is
to
this
stop.
okay? The size of it? I mean, because when we're, that's okay? Because we're on gallery mode on the right hand side, so a bit of it is.
It should be okay. I mean, people can always minimize the speakers. I mean the thumbnails that have speakers' faces also. You can always do that. Right. Hi, Anirudh.
Hi. Sorry, I took a couple of minutes to join.
Yeah, hi, Anirudh.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Hi.
Right. I think we can start.
Welcome on.
All of us are here. So everything is working well.
I think attendees are also coming in.
Can you check if the attendees are here?
Yeah, I mean, that's you right now.
Yeah, there are 25.
It's coming in at 6:15, I guess, and in another 10 minutes they'll join in, but we can start, I guess. Right. Okay, good evening and good afternoon, present here. My name is Aishwarya, and I'm joined here with Padma Shri and Monica. We are Conscious Bangalore. It's a local chapter of this international movement called Conscious Cities, and we are geared towards human-centered environments which are science-informed and democratic, so to speak, in terms of involving all the disciplines and also moving towards data-driven architecture. So for today, Monica would be moderating the panel in the manner of speaking. So I will pass the mic to her.
All right. So thank you. And
moderating the participants and questions, and looking forward to doing that.
Yeah. So yeah, I think to all the participants who are here, the viewers, we are also live on YouTube because yesterday we were having some technical difficulties. People couldn't join the Zoom link. So if you want, you can tell them to log into the Conscious Bengaluru YouTube channel, and yeah, you can check us out there. So I'll just share my screen here with you. Yeah, so you're welcome to everyone here today, speakers and the viewers. So like Aishwarya said, we're Conscious Bangalore. This is part of our second session for our webinar series of 3 sessions. So today we're actually looking at the session titled City Planning, Resilience and Pandemics, a critical eye for the city's preparedness for pandemics. And today we have 4 speakers with us. So let me just introduce them to you a little bit. So we have Professor Bhatti with us from CASA UCL. We also have a couple of familiar faces, I think, Jwala and architect Anup. Jwala is a neuropsychologist from Cognitive Neurology Clinic and the Green Oak Initiative, and architect Anup is from IUDI and Urban Frame. So we also have Anirudh, who's also another familiar face to us. He's from Pragma Development Advisor. He's a development consultant. So let me just introduce the topic a little bit here before we kind of put across the questions to the speaker. So a city in a sense is actually the outdoors. So people live in the outdoors. So with the existing limitations, the third spaces or corridors are now turning into living nodes. So does this change the way we perceive livable spaces in cities, perhaps? Are we in battle to put forth strict countermeasures in controlling the current outbreak of the novel COVID-19 pandemic? Especially, we want to understand from this discussion how conscious cities in the future will perhaps be able to deal with a pandemic, or how they'll be able to prepare for a pandemic. So yeah, so I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and I think I'll just ask the speakers to introduce yourselves and maybe a little bit about the work that you do and how your work relates to planning and pandemic, so that our viewers can, just know a little bit more about you. Maybe Professor Bhatti can start, and followed by Jwala, Anup, and Anirudh.
Okay, well, by training, I'm an architect planner originally, and I've worked a lot in geographical areas, spatial analysis and things like that. And for a number of years, many years in fact, we've been involved in developing computer models of cities so we can make predictions. And the simplest way to think of those is that we are focused very much in our group on land use transportation models. We do develop lots of other sorts of models, agent-based and so on, but they're essentially computer models that enable us to make predictions. So we're very much focused on cities. We're part of a faculty of architecture and planning, which is called the Bartlett. We're one of about 10 units really in the Bartlett. The biggest, of course, are architecture and separately planning. But there's things like heritage, the Energy Institute, conservation, and so on. Basically, in our group, we're very much involved in looking at data in cities, big data, and so on. And some of the models that we use are similar in structure to the pandemic models that are very, very important at the present time in terms of predicting the development of the pandemic and so on. Okay, so that's basically what we do. We run an MSc in smart cities and urban analytics. We like to think that we're very much involved in the future of cities, thinking about what might happen in the future. And most of our work is based on data of various sorts in this particular context. So that's the kind of thrust I think that our group will be able to develop with respect to the sort of post-pandemic city, the sort of the new normal, as people call it, or beginning to call it, because of course, when we see the end of this pandemic, if we see the end, well, we will see the end of it at some particular point, but things will be very different. The economy is going to be highly restructured, I think we all probably be a lot poorer, basically, in some senses. We might be a bit wiser as well, in some sense, because this pandemic is the first pandemic really for about 100 years, essentially. The last really big pandemic was at the end of the First World War in 1917-18, when about I think 5 million people died during that pandemic worldwide. In fact, there were more people died in 1918 from the pandemic than were actually killed in the First World War. And then really there have been smaller pandemics, 1947 to 8 and so on, and then this particular pandemic. And of course, one of the things that's particularly interesting is that a number of nations, probably India as well, but certainly in the UK, we've had a number of scenarios about pandemics, and quite recently, within the last 5 years, the government had a task force working on major crises, looking at the medium-term major crises, one of which was the sort of global pandemic, which was identified as being the most serious, because everything, as we know, gets kind of closed down in a pandemic so that we can actually sort of flatten the curve, as it were, sort of basically suppress it. So anyway, so that's where I come from, basically, and hopefully I'll be able to contribute a few things in the next hour or so related to, my perspective.
Twila?
Hi, I'm Twila Aniline. I'm a neuropsychologist, and thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure being part of this interdisciplinary platform. So I think Conscious Bangalore found me through the community work that we do. I work a lot with brain injury, and we do a lot of research with dementia. And we run a small community project with older people and people with dementia, where they come in, and we also sort of try to rope in the local community to take part in the program, supporting older people and the patients with dementia. And now we're trying to sort of move this across the city using this as a model center. But I think the scenario we are in right now is quite different to what I normally do. Mental health is quite a huge area that we would be now focusing on following the manifestation of the pandemic itself. There's a lot of literature from the past and also what we're seeing as of now. And I think India is actually quite prepared to some extent compared to how it may have been in the past. I think now we do see a lot more psychological helplines. We see generally the psychological and the psychiatry fraternity very strong and getting ready to handle any sort of psychological issues that are coming up. But we still have a lot to go in terms of being more prepared and also trying to see how we could manage this better in the future. So that's what I would be bringing in today.
Good evening. Good evening, everybody. I'm Anup. I'm an architect, urban designer by training. A lot of my work and our group's work focuses on user-centric design. And we help a lot of the smart cities. We are on the advisory for a lot of the smart cities on what they need to do as they go forward. So probably a relevant topic to actually look at how resilience is being looked at most of these smart cities. There's another part of what we do as a collective practice is we run a foundation called as a Responsible City Foundation, where a lot of our work goes into this. Our focus has been to mainstream sustainability across at the fractal level and to the city level. So in many ways, connecting multiple parts of urban planning, ecology, landscape, urban design, user-centric design, and I'm sure that as we take this discussion forward, a lot of insights will come through. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Anu. Anirudh?
Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon to Professor Batty. And thanks for having me here. I'm quite excited to be a part of this because as a development consultant, a lot of the conversations that I've been having or the work I've been doing the last couple of weeks has been in relation to the COVID crisis, has been on economy, has been on public health. And it's quite refreshing that, the discussion is revolving around the city and urban development over here. So it's a new take for me as well. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to bring something to this. To introduce myself, I did my master's in public policy from the National Law School. So I'm a policy practitioner by training, but the urban development sector is something that I've been involved in for quite some time. In fact, my first involvement with the urban sector goes back to a little assignment that I did in college, which happened completely by mistake. And then from then on, I also did my dissertation on an urban development issue, which was on unauthorized colonies and the provision of basic public services in the city of Delhi. After that, I worked with a multinational consulting firm for a couple of years. That was with Grant Thornton, and I was working with the public sector advisory practice, and I was specializing over there in urban infrastructure. So a lot of the projects that I worked on over there dealt with urban issues. One was, one projects that I was consistently involved in was the Smart Cities project, of course, where we were doing project management for about 6 smart cities at the time. And also I worked on a couple of urban transport projects and, water and sanitation projects as well. And since then, I've moved on from Grant Thornton. Now I'm running my own development consulting firm along with 2 other partners. It's a young startup development consulting firm. We're only a year old now. And while I would like to continue to focus on urban issues, unfortunately, because it's an entrepreneurial venture and it's a startup, we haven't been able to focus, or rather, I haven't been able to focus solely on the urban space. But going forward, as we build capability, I'm hoping that we're able to continue working or furthering our work in the urban development space, and see that as a dedicated vertical within the firm as well. So today I'm hoping to contribute a little bit by bringing the narrative of the public policy and governance and that angle to city development, and how city planning can take into account crises like this and try to plan a little better so that we can deal with situations like this going forward. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from.
You're muted, Maria.
Monica, you're muted.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Anirudh. And thank you all for taking the time out to be here with us today. So I'm just going to share my screen here now with the questions. So let me just do that. Okay. Yeah, so just a minute. Why is this? No. Excuse me, I think there's an issue. I'm just, yeah, okay. All right, so yeah, I'm just going to start off this session by saying, by asking, are the caves and forests strong, secure, and warm enough to wade through the winters? And with that in mind, I'm going to, we're addressing these 3 questions now. So firstly, this pandemic doesn't seem to discriminate, but are the most vulnerable well protected? For example, the elderly, the youngsters who are living alone, the daily wage workers, and even the urban poor, to name a few. How can urban designers, planners, data scientists, mental health experts, and also policy researchers help in this sort of unique situation that we find ourselves in? Secondly, what does a post-pandemic city look like to you? What elements of the urban fabric do you think can evolve in response to infectious disease and the related mass hysteria? And are we actually going to take lessons from this COVID-19 pandemic seriously, or is it just going to be like any of the other historical, public health related catastrophes like the SARS or MERS? And thirdly, how can we really build social resilience and cultivate empathy during such a crisis? From volunteering to serve the hungry, and from retrofitting existing public buildings as temporary shelters, and to providing emotional support to the ailing. So really, how are we building social resilience, and how are we going to cultivate empathy? So these are the three questions that we pose to you. So let me just, yeah. So those are the three questions, and it would be great if you could, maybe if Jwala, maybe if you want to sort of start off because you have a presentation, and then we could be followed by Professor Batty, Anup, and then Anirudh.
Are you able to see it?
Not yet.
Let me just share.
Yeah.
Okay. We already talked about this. Okay, so I'd like to start with two quotes from the pandemic that's happening right now, and one from the past. So at present, Dr. Banerjee describes saying that the pandemics are far from being just a medical phenomena. They disrupt personal and professional lives severely and affect people and societies on several levels. The key strategies promoted for containment of an outbreak of this nature are isolation and physical distancing. Both can have significant impacts on our life and relationships. And this we could all relate in the present scenario. And one from the past, which is more an aftermath study of mental health after a pandemic. They say pandemics take a toll on the emotional resilience on those who have not yet in harm's way. So these are people who have not been affected. And the sudden and massive loss lead to increased helplessness, anxiousness, and survivors felt experience of anger, guilt, confusion, and abandonment. So this is what we'll be going into in a few weeks, months. This is what people are going to be feeling like. And very interestingly, when I was sort of trying to look at what have we learned from the past, I came across this very nice paper in 2018, which marked the 100-year anniversary of the 1918 influenza, also known as the Spanish flu. And it was really nice. I don't think these authors really knew where we were heading for in 2 years later. But they very well put down how, if we did have a pandemic, we would be better prepared than in 1918. But it's still so unpredictable because our demographics are completely different at this point. And what struck me the most when I was looking at things that we have learned from the past is that there has been so much work done in the mental health space and the effects of a pandemic on mental health. However, I think somewhere this hasn't really reached the policy protocols as yet, as stringently as we would have liked it to be. So let's look at fast forward to where we are right now, and we have a city with a pandemic. We have people with pre-existing health conditions and pre-existing stressors, and then we have people who don't even have their basic needs met as yet. But what is really, I think, what really impacts mental health is the ability and the resilience to change and adapt to a situation. So what comes with a pandemic is a lot of change. And with that changes a person's lifestyle. So you have people who've been working at home or people who've been working at offices and now they're working at home. And they have to sort of adapt their entire lifestyle to the present condition. You have changes in family dynamics. So you have the lady of the house who runs the house completely on her own. And suddenly now the man is sitting in the house and calling the shots, which is going to bring about a lot of conflict. And then you have the actual physical space, which, if you're at an advantage, you have larger spaces, but a lot of people live in apartments, closed spaces, extremely small, which can, of course, manifest in different ways. And all this manifests in different sort of psychological conditions, which can vary from being extremely mild to a very severe psychiatric condition. So you can have depression, loneliness, anxiety, helplessness, anger, frustration, and the reason for all this is primarily stress. So talking about our vulnerable populations, this is one of the questions. And what I'd like to focus here on is it's not just populations who are going to be affected by COVID. It's things that can affect you beyond COVID. Because when we talk about what a pandemic leaves you with, it's not just the condition, but it's the other things that come with it. So when we talk about older adults, social isolation is not really new to them. It's a way of life for some of them, but it's compounded when it comes with misinformation. It's compounded when it comes with not being able to have access to basic needs. And that's when you have, mental health issues. Not being able to go out and exercise is a huge thing for older adults. And then, we have at the bottom the immune suppressed as well, and they get affected quite greatly because their immunity is low, and then more anxious they are, the immunity is going to go down further. And you have people with special needs, it's hard enough to contain them or to manage their challenging behaviors on a regular day, and give them a pandemic. They're not going to understand there's a pandemic and they have to socially isolate themselves. And these are places where we really need to work closely with the government. And people who don't have basic needs, this is the most important, the first most basic important factor for mental wellness. And that's just meeting your basic needs. If you're not eating well, if you don't have good nutrition, your immunity is going to be lower, and that's going to probably get you to have COVID or any other medical condition. So when you just look at news from the current scenario that's going on across the world right now, we know that the health workers and the patients who are affected seem to be at the highest risk in terms of mental health. And of course, the elderly, because the social isolation does get to them. And what was interesting was the adverse effects of quarantine without information and knowledge. So it's when you give people a choice that you can socially isolate and they take that choice on their own, their mental health is probably going to be much better than when it's forced down them. And another thing that's sort of coming across a lot is domestic violence. And this is going across worldwide, and this is quite worrying and very upsetting for a lot of people. And there's still a lot more to come in terms of mental health, and we just have to brace ourselves for it. So when we talk about preparing and managing for better mental health, for older adults, I think we need to sort of work with the community, trying to make sure people in the community are able to support the older adults in a safe way, providing them with accurate information. I think one of the most scariest thing now is for most people, or rather for a large population, even in India, I think their source of news is WhatsApp and social media, which a lot of people who are quite naive are not able to sift through to see what is good news or real news and what is fake news. And same with people living in a community with immunocompromised. We need to make sure they have protective gear, they have their basic medical needs, facilities. And people with social needs as well, I think they definitely need a lot more attention. To just give you an anecdote of, I think, a country in Europe, they realized that autistic children, they're just not going to be able to contain them. And they came up with a policy where any autistic child could go out provided they wore a blue t-shirt, so that the authorities knew that they were not just gallivanting and they had a reason for being out there. So we could sort of work around the community and find ways to safely have let people just expel some energy and lead healthier lives during the pandemic. And of course, ensuring basic needs for people who don't have it. So it's not all grim. I think we do have a lot going for us. We're all here meeting virtually, and that's fantastic. We have deliveries happening to us. So we are, although we are in a lockdown, our access is a lot better, but this is to a very, very small percentage of people. And there are still a lot of people out there who are fighting hard. So going forward, I feel in terms of protocols, we need to sort of really put down protocols and plans for pandemics or communicable diseases, keeping in mind the psycho and the social impact that it could have on people. Like I was just thinking, in terms of education, this should be in our textbooks. And also in terms of, like in the UK, Professor Maddie, you probably know, you have fire drills. So we could probably have a social isolation drill once a year where everyone experiences what it's like to do it and to try it out, so that when we are in a situation that really calls for it, we're prepared mentally. When things are unpredictable, that's when you have panic, that's when you have more anxiety. So we need proper communication. We need people to be calm, be able to mitigate panic, and just ensuring basic needs. It's been found that effective and rapid communication is the most effective when it comes to getting points across, debunking fake news. And I think we should have more psychologists in public health and policy making, because especially social psychologists have worked a lot in sort of understanding mass behavior and also sort of influencing a larger population. So we could use them to try to find ways to promote altruistic choice of social distancing, so that it doesn't come to a complete lockdown that the government has to pose. So I think in India, we do have a lot of helplines that have come up. So if you do feel that you are not feeling great, you should reach out. You should stop, nip the problem at the bud, as they say. And the Green Oak Initiative is launching a helpline for the healthcare workers next week. So do refer people if you know anyone in the healthcare space. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jwala. I do think that going forward, we need to look at the protocols and plans in governance, and also have more people from your field in the governance and policy sector. So I think we can move on now to Professor Bhatti.
Okay. Right. Let me say something about the current pandemic. That it's pretty clear, I think, now that this particular pandemic is very different from everyone we've received, everyone that the world has received since for about 200 years, I think. Perhaps it's the most serious pandemic of all time in some sense. And that's largely, I think, because of connectivity, that the world is now completely connected in a way that was not the case when, for example, the SARS epidemic began, which was a much, perhaps more serious virus, but nevertheless was less virulent and in that sense was suppressed relatively easily. But back in 15 or more years ago, when that epidemic began, the world was much less connected than it is today, in the sense that if you look at the history of information technology, then it's argued that there's a sea change in information technology which took place around about 2007, when the iPhone was introduced, when we all began to get smartphones, in a sense, which could then immediately connect up to the web and so on. So this is the kind of connectivity that has grown dramatically in the last 20 years. If you look at the pandemic in 1918, which was just was mentioned by Jwala, that particular pandemic, in fact, was not well understood at all. It simply ripped through populations and basically left a lot of people dead. But there wasn't the media to actually transmit information about the epidemic, and there wasn't the media to enable one to actually understand and to actually deal with it in some sense. So we are in some sense in a strange position of having a lot of information about the pandemic and a lot of discussion about it in a way that was never really the case in terms of past pandemics in that sense. When this pandemic is squeezed out of the system in some way, and it's an open question as to how long that's going to take. There's a lot of talk in the UK at the moment, and everywhere else for that matter, about how long social distancing and isolation and so on will continue. And it's extremely problematic. They talk about the exit strategy in some senses, and that really is sort of reaching a world where really the virus has been suppressed in some sense. And many people say that it's probably only really when we get some kind of vaccine, which could take 12 months or longer, and then we begin mass immunization, that we'll really squeeze it out of the system. At the moment, isolation and lockdown and so on is basically a very artificial situation in which we don't know, as Twila said, we don't know what the impact on our psychological state will be of this. That in the UK we've had this lockdown for about 3 weeks at the moment, etc. And people have been reasonably good, basically. There's some breaking of it, but not much. And in that particular context, but we don't know what the sort of the effects will be on people within the next 3 weeks and 3 weeks after that, and so on. So really, it's unknown territory in every sense. What's very sobering about this pandemic is that in some respects, it's one of the simplest causes of a global catastrophe that you could ever imagine. And we've known all about viruses for hundreds of years in this particular context, and most public health over the last 200 years has dealt with them fairly successfully, sort of in some sense. Malaria, cholera, all of these sorts of diseases have been tackled in a sense. So this is an unusual one in the sense that we're in the business of trying to do something about it while it's actually happening, and that's been to a large extent unprecedented in the past. Okay, so that's really the pandemic, and of course, in some respects, what's happening over the next 6 months or a year, etc., assuming that it takes this sort of time for it to be sort of squeezed out. At the same time, there is another pandemic going on, which is the state of the economy, in some sense. That I'm sure you're all well aware of, the financial crisis and all of these sorts of things, and the Great Depression and so on. Well, to some extent, a lot of thinking about how those sorts of economic catastrophes began is not too dissimilar, in some sense, from the kind of models of infection that really deal with pandemics and so on. So, once the public health issue, the biology of this is sorted out in some senses, assuming it can be over the next 12 months or so on, we have to really deal with the economy in some sense, and then also with the social issues that Twila has referred to already, which are really major in some sense. So I think what we'll see, in fact, is a movement towards many of these social and economic questions. It's already happening in that sense. And of course, in some respects, the issue, I think, is what will the post-pandemic city really look like, in some sense, after all of this? That, as I said in my introduction earlier on, that everybody's now talking about the new normal, basically, that things will not return back to normal in this sense. I mean, President Trump, of course, keeps saying they will return back to normal. It'll be even more normal than normal, basically. But in fact, I think that's completely misguided. It's much more likely that there'll be some very serious repercussions on the economy in terms of work. People will use this as an opportunity to do things differently in some senses. And of course, we don't know what the economic destruction will basically be. Even if China is able, as it seems to be at the moment, to be able to clamp down and get people slowly back to work, there's really nobody, in the West, in America and so on, who's going to be able to get out and buy the goods, basically, to some extent. So this is very different from a normal financial crisis in some senses. So there's some big questions with this respect. Now, of course, in terms of the post-pandemic city, that this will remain, I think, in our consciousness, this event, for many years, and it'll begin to change our way of doing things. For example, one very obvious thing, of course, is the density at which we live. If you look at the United Kingdom, if you look at Britain over the last 50 years or so, perhaps a bit longer, the amount of housing per head, the amount of space that we actually have, has actually been reducing. Whereas in the United States, houses, or the average house, has got bigger. In the UK, the average house has got smaller, more people are living in flats and this kind of thing. And in some sense, in other words, we're saying that densities have got greater in some respects. The amount of usable space in and around the house has actually got smaller. And that's quite problematic from the point of view of social distancing in some respects. And it could well be that what we will see, in the post-pandemic city is a slow but maybe a rapid movement towards a more decentralized kind of city. The notion of the compact city, if you like, is not very resonant with the notion of dealing with pandemics, etc., in this particular context. And much depends, I think, on how the population at large begins to react to this notion of the pandemic over the next 10, 15, 20 years, over the next generations in this particular context. And it may be that we will move towards a more decentralized world. And of course, that's very counter to many of the trends in urban planning, which really relate to how we think of the future in some sense. The future, more sustainable future with a better quality of life, is always predicated on the basis of the compact city in some sense, the movement towards public transport from private transport and so on in this context. Now, we may still see some of those trends, the movement from private to public in some sense, which is going on, the movement towards greener and more sustainable modes of travel, such as obviously walking, biking, things of that sort in some sense. So we may see all these things still going on, but in a much more decentralized world. So it may sound to some extent the death knell for the idea of the future city, the big city in this particular context. In fact, if you look at city sizes, the biggest action worldwide is in small towns. You have to be a big city, you've got to be a small city first. You've got to be a small town to some extent, and in some senses, all of the action is in terms of small towns growing. So even though our big cities are getting bigger, they're not getting bigger faster than the small cities are growing in that context. So it could well be that we drift back a bit towards smaller cities in that sense. And of course, a city can only get so big. In fact, the very biggest cities in the world are not really cities at all. They're urban agglomerations, things like the Greater Bay Area in Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Macau, and so on in this particular context. The same in the Shanghai, Nanjing region, and so on. And I'm sure you have the same in terms of Delhi and Calcutta and Mumbai and all of your big cities in that context. So to some extent, that's going to be a big question mark, about the degree to which the future city is spread out. It's sprawling not necessarily sprawling in a bad way. Sprawl is used as a pejorative term in the West in this particular context, but it can also be intelligent. They talk about smart growth or smart sprawl in that sense in America. So to some extent, we might see a drift in that particular way, because that has implications for housing design and urban design and so on in this context. And we might see, this will much depend on possible changes in our behavior with respect to how we interact with others in that sense. So for example, you're probably already aware that the idea of shaking hands, for example, as a greeting is sort of off the agenda in terms of this coronavirus and so on. The idea of bumping elbows and that kind of thing is sort of is very much being talked about at the present time. So there may be some quite significant changes in social behaviour in terms of distancing in this sense. The other issue, which is very interesting from my perspective, really, is that there's a lot of talk in terms of the future city about the future city being highly automated in that sense. So, the notion about autonomous vehicles and so on, or energy efficient vehicles is not really related to autonomous vehicles particularly, but autonomous vehicles, intelligent cars. Now, I think we might reevaluate some of these sorts of things too. That there's a lot of hype, of course, about autonomous cars. One of the interesting things about autonomous vehicles is that we've now had people thinking about autonomous vehicles for 20 years or more, intelligent cars, and really nothing has happened. That the environment in which cities exist, etc., is probably too complicated, basically, for the kind of autonomous cars that are talked about. It's all right for Google to look at its autonomous cars in Silicon Valley on these wide highways in very low density and so on. But when it comes to existing cities, cities like your own and ours in the UK, basically, it's much more difficult. So we might see some big changes in terms of thinking about automation in that sense, in terms of the future city in this sense. So in some senses, I'll summarize because I know other people are going to talk. The big question is, what will cities look like? And I think we're going to be engaging in a big debate about this. It's not at all clear, just as we have no clarity whatsoever about the ultimate meaning of this pandemic, in a sense. I think all our ideas are being turned upside down to some extent. There are some unmentionable ideas in all of this, and this is the notion that our societies have reacted in such a way as to try to save life in some senses, etc. And I think when the pandemic is over, there'll be a lot of thinking about how we best do this. We might see in our country, for example, we have a National Health Service, as you know. I'm sure you have a similar sort of thing in India, but the National Health Service has always been under pressure, and as populations age, as they are doing in the UK, they're all under pressure. This has seen a big change in national health. We might actually see some very interesting developments in terms of the importance of the health system after this, and that will involve quite a lot of redirection of resources by government, etc. We may see some big changes in taxation and so on. So at that point, I'm going to stop. Number of ideas here, and I'm interested in what the rest of the group are saying about the post-pandemic city. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think that was really interesting. I mean, we are really, I think we are also really interested to understand what a future city would look like, and will we really move towards decentralization? That is something to think about. So I think Architect Anup, now you can.
Yeah, thank you so much. What's interesting is that when you take this pandemic in its core, you can look at it as a large global phenomenon, and might be it's coming through in the next 100-year cycle. But if you actually look at it from another point, when we continuously speak about the flattened world, right? It's no more this. When you look at big data, when you start looking at it from a technology point of view, you're always talking about this flat world. So I think this is a classic case of how we need to address this flattened world in many ways. So I think that's where it becomes interesting to place an argument forward. I would not take a step back saying that diseases actually shape cities. And it's happened in the Spanish flu in 1918. And not too far away in Bangalore, where we live today, is the plague did that. We had 2 new localities came in. There were regulations written around that. So it's quite interesting in this time and age that diseases are shaping cities. And I'm sure that this discussion will not end here. It will continue to see what this new future will take us forward. What it does, though, it actually puts the planning and the civil engineering and the services mill grinding harder. And I'm sure that it's just a matter of time that we need to start thinking out of the box to see if there are solutions available for this. This also comes from a very critical point today that today, if you take a classic case of the spread of this pandemic itself, and somebody was narrating the story that if Germany has this huge car production factory units, and these parts come from Wuhan, and a person travels from Wuhan to Germany to help the training. So what's interesting, it's about not the city. If you actually look at it, it is about how peri-urban Wuhan and semi-urban territories of Bavaria, and all of them get connected. So it's a very interesting position to look at, because more than anything, we're starting to look at this focus from a city introverted, myopic point of view. But actually, this whole narrative starts from somewhere else. So today, I feel at the cities level, we start to relook at how these peri-urban areas, how we look at these semi-urban areas, suburbs, are also playing a very, very big role in the way this pandemic is moving around. So it's not about the city; it's also how we deal with the perimeters of the city. It actually draws us to a very interesting position as urban designers, urban planners, to start looking at public health very, very critically. And most often what happens in this domain is that, you put your services, you put your drains, and that's the end of the story. Nobody is ever thinking beyond that. What are you doing with your waste management today? What is solid waste management happening within the city and the city parameters? And and from a purely solid waste management, this goes and gets dumped in another peri-urban or suburban part of the city. So you look at how this whole cycle is vicious, right? So it's just a loop where somewhere we should be careful from an urban planner's point of view, urban designer's point of view, that we need to start looking at, can you make these impacts smaller? Can you actually start decentralizing services? Can you go back and start looking at city from a point that it's built of multiple components, and each of these fractals which the city has is independent by itself. That way, what happens tomorrow, let's say purely from a point of how we are going to live in future. Let's say I have to have a lockdown. Tomorrow, look at the impact of what a lockdown is going to happen, right? That means the central services has to come in, you have to block it off. There are other issues coming in it. So might be when we start re-looking at or re-engaging with the future, it will come back to starting to see the city as larger, as smaller fractals, which then become a completely different game altogether, because that will start kind of connecting these multiple orbits together. This also leads to another big issue, what we've always been dealing with, that is densities. And I'm sure we are sitting in a time bomb with respect to densities. And it's not a joke, because today you look at how, if you start looking at real estate on one hand, you start looking at transfer of development in another hand, and you start looking at cities growth, suddenly you will have this huge booming up of high densities along these transit corridors, which is as much as in limited areas, FSI is going to up by an average of 5 to 6. And there's a classic case today. Delhi is going through, it's fighting its battle. Mumbai is fighting its battle. Bangalore is fighting its battle around that. So what do you deal with such a kind of a scenario? So it goes back to actually seeing how we need to start looking at policy at one hand, implication at the other hand, long-term studies of this from an impact point of view. And just scary numbers, if you take Hong Kong would be at close to around 18,000 people per square mile. And it's not a joke. And it's no different from how a Mumbai survives today. Sometimes you can't even sleep to imagine that if there is a massive outbreak in a slum like Dharavi and it's already hitting that number, what would happen, right? So when you start looking at densities, I think we need to start reimagining the way city structures are itself going to be read. There's another way to it. I'll come from a point of view that today, for economic reasons, for political reasons, for reasons of convenience, we start reading the city as sets of wards. Yeah, that is purely functional denominator. But more from an emergency point of view, from actually attacking this pandemic point of view, or tomorrow from a resilience point of view, we need to have different ways in which the city can be read. It can't go back to the traditional system of actually reading it ward-wise. It should go back to saying that, okay, there is a hospital here. Does it cater to 10,000 people? That is a new health ward. If you go back to saying, okay, this is a transport corridor, this is a bus stand, this is the new transport ward. If I'm going to look at schools, then this is, can I look at this as a distinct school ward? So the blurring of boundaries from an administrative point of view will become very, very important as we go forward, because we've always looked at traditional ward and revenue out of ward as one interconnected element. But today, when we start looking at the city, it really is important that we kind of break this old mold of reading the city purely from a ward-based format. What it does, though, it's interesting, is that it's completely dynamic. So, and this complete dynamic state also links back to central core data which you require. Most often today you find, I'm saying every news channel worth its salt is blaring information at you, and most often they are wavering from one another as data points, and each city will give you different data points on what's happening around today in a very complex engagement, like how our cities are working today, because most often our infrastructure is playing catch up with where the city is growing. So it's important that we start working on this whole element of this big data. And this big data is common for all the execution components in the city. Maybe the police, maybe it is the medical, maybe it is the planners, maybe it is the city itself. This is one common data which is available, because then it becomes easier for us to start reading the city simplistically. Otherwise, today we have data which is all over the place, and that's a fundamental problem today of even looking at kind of putting a plan to the city. This leads to actually purely from a professional, from an urban design professional, I feel that we might have 5 mandates as we go forward. One will be to start looking at focus on access to core services. Here, I mean water, housing, and healthcare. This leads to very clear-cut definitions of how we deal with issues of density and this idea of access. Access, I mean accessibility here. The second will be to look at affordable housing and public spaces. Trust me, our narrative on the affordable housing has just gotten steam, but the worry in that is that the densities could go really rapidly higher. We might have to re-engage in the way we look at housing densities from here on. Public spaces will be realigned. We'll have to relook at how public spaces are getting done. The third component is to look at how we are able to integrate green and blue spaces. What I mean by spaces are the green and blue networks. That is your green corridor networks and the blue networks. Most often in our own city planning modes, these are just left out. They're not integrated into the plans at all. So it just might make sense now to relook at a calibration from open space mandate, that we pull back these open spaces, these watersheds, forests, and parks into the core of planning. The fourth point will be to look at how we can link the increased city and regional planning. So we actually have to start looking at a bigger picture for this and start looking at whether support systems can be enabled. I think it's important to focus on the economy. It's important to focus when we look at city and the suburban area to look at how energy, how your transport networks work, and for food production. So most important is to see that how zones of your reducing your zero food miles can be looked at. So that's something which can be pushed heavily. And the other point I'm saying is would be to look at working on more city level and granular data. I think today, I'm sure with the 140 smart cities which are on an annual, it is a good time for actually to look at very strong granular data, which now becomes common base for every single agency to start using. I think this would largely cover the aspects which I'm thinking of from how it would start impacting an urban designer, planner, and an architect. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anup. I think that you really have really relatable examples, and we should really look at our the density of cities and how our public spaces and our transport networks really need to be looked at, and the administration also has to be looked at. And this gives us a good segue to be ready for Anirudh's perspective as a policy practitioner.
Thank you. It's a little daunting to go after three speakers with such structured views about the issue at hand, but I'm going to try to do my best over here. And I think I've been trying to think about this, and a lot of this is going to be a little unstructured because I'm still trying to put together pieces of the puzzle in my head. But largely, I see action through this pandemic as well as post this pandemic in sort of three verticals that we really need to consider. So one is the infra question, right? So the first thing that we think of when we think of the post-pandemic city is actually infrastructure and what we could do to sort of make cities better, plan for cities better. So in terms of infrastructure, I think there's a couple of different strings that we can pull at. One is, of course, the access to services and things which Anup has already touched on, so I'm not going to go into too much detail over there. But when we do have situations like this lockdown, it's imperative that everyone is able to access these basic services. And I think that's a real problem across cities in the country today. I mean, whether you look at the largest urban agglomerations like Delhi and Mumbai, or whether you look at smaller cities that are on the verge of becoming mega cities in the next coming few years, like say Kanpur, Lucknow, and even cities just off the periphery like Ghaziabad and Faridabad and Mysore and Tumkur for that matter. So I think there's a huge shift in thought that's required in ensuring that planning for these cities changes to make sure that we look into questions of density, access to services, and all of those things. The second thing that comes in when we talk about infrastructure is actually technology or other systems that can ease city development, right? So if we consider things like development control norms, for instance, is something that is just not followed in most cities. I mean, while there is this semblance of a plan that has to be submitted and everything, what actually comes out when you see a city like Bangalore is you've got buildings which are basically conjoined, even though there are minimum setbacks that are supposed to be maintained and things like that. And though there has been repeated clamor, and especially in cities like Delhi, which are prone to earthquakes, about the public health hazards that these kind of developments pose, there has been very little action, and I'm really hoping that this becomes a shock to the system so that people start to take it a little bit more seriously. And I think this has to come both ways. It's not just the government or the municipal bodies that need to enforce this, but also the citizens themselves have to be cognizant of what these things stand for. And that will come down to the participation bit, which I'll talk about in a little while. So this is another question. This is a question of, once the planning is done, how are you enforcing that planning? Because just leaving the plans on paper in a master plan is not enough. It's also important to actually ensure that things come about. And I think one of the questions also is regarding these trenches or conservancies as we have in Bangalore, which is actually a very, in the plague affected parts like Malleshwaram and even earlier bits of development in Chamarajpet in Bangalore, we actually do have conservancies and these trench-like structures as part of the city planning itself. But in a lot of cases, these are often ignored. Sometimes they're built over. Sometimes they're used as additional structures that are jutting out of the existing planned buildings and things like that. So I think there is really a need to look at how these can be enforced better, and that's something that really needs to be looked at in a post-pandemic city, because these essentials need to be followed to ensure that we're able to cope with issues like this. And the third is actually systems that can be integrated into existing developments, right? So there has been a lot of talk. I mean, I was just reading a couple of articles about there's this pressure differential system to contain air within certain rooms, and people are saying that you should try to implement that in larger commercial spaces, in residential localities and things like that. There is talk about air filtration systems the same way that we have on say flights, and in integrating that into public transport like the metro. But I think we also need to, I mean, while we talk about these technologies, it's important to consider them. But from a policy point of view, we also need to look at, how these mesh with development as a whole. Because when we talk about adding technologies like this in, we have to weigh the trade-off between the increase in cost that is going to result from such technology and the problem that it seeks to solve, or the risk of uh, the problem that it seeks to solve actually happening. So when we talk about air filtration, for instance, and putting a system like that in a place like the metro, it becomes a huge challenge because that increases the cost of the system and operating the system, which also impacts the common citizen and the people that it's actually trying to benefit. So I think while we do need to look at these technologies, we also need to look at the cost and the benefit that's being derived from them. And of course, these technologies do have a place in certain areas, but we also need to look at, so, when we talk about investments in public transport itself, that could have a huge benefit, because that could mean that we could have smarter sprawl, as Professor Batty put it. We could have, instead of these densely packed mega cities that we have currently, we could actually have people living further away, so that you don't have densely packed settlements which are prone to the spread of viruses and things like that. But yeah, I mean, we need to see where such investments need to be made. And I think that's something that from a policy perspective is something that really needs to be considered going forward. And I think the way that this pandemic is going to affect it is that there are going to be a lot more considerations. And I'm hoping that people will take considerations like this a lot more seriously. I mean, we have issues of water collecting and hence mosquito breeding every year, and we know that dengue breaks out every year, but we still haven't really made a concerted enough push to actually stop that problem from occurring. So I'm hoping that a shock like this will be what is the required push to actually make people consider that a little further in enforcing plans. The second is in terms of management itself. I think while infrastructure is an expensive option in many cases, management is something that can be done. So, one of the really good things, and this is not from a city development perspective, but one of the really good things that has come out of the government action over the last couple of days is a policy on telemedicine, which was actually an unregulated space completely. In fact, the government stand on it was to not, I mean, it was an uncertain whether that is required or not at all in the first place. So these operators like Yourfit and Practo were operating in this regulatory gray area. And within the last 2 weeks since the lockdown has been imposed, noting that this could actually mean benefits for both the population as well as the healthcare professionals themselves, the government has gone ahead and actually put out a very comprehensive set of guidelines on telemedicine. So when we leverage, technology and manage our systems better, I think there is a huge sort of scope in containing issues in containing pandemics like this. So a couple of simple examples that we can think about is Changi Airport in Singapore recently put together this contactless security check, which is a system that can actually be enforced quite easily in terms of the investment that's required to sort of put things in like that in place. So I think we really need to look at how we can leverage technology and manage our resources better, manage the infrastructure that we have to actually have smarter solutions to deal with situations like this. And the third strand that I really think is probably the most important out of all this is participation itself. Because when we when the lockdown was imposed, for instance, there were cases of police brutality because we simply did not have the sort of the systems in place for us to ensure that people had access to the essential items that they needed. We didn't know what essential items were. There was a lot of confusion about what is really essential and what should be sold and what should be manufactured, what should be transported. And also, how do you monitor who's going out and what they're doing outside, right? And these were all systems that basically, and because we didn't really have solutions to any of these questions, what resulted was this chaotic, thing about people hoarding, people going out when they were not supposed to, the police not knowing how to react to this, and then brutality and all of that. And it wasn't until a couple of days later that we actually had the pass system that is currently in place right now. But if we were to actually collaborate and participate a little better, I think that a lot of these troubles can actually be sort of smoothened out, and we can actually uh, minimize the damage that occurs from all of this and have a swifter response to most issues. So this is not just participation. I mean, there is this culture within the government that a lot of things happen within silos. In fact, it was interesting that someone brought together technology and smart cities, because when we were working on smart cities, one of the questions that we were constantly grappling with is this idea of the integrated command and control center, which is part of almost every smart city, span city initiatives. But while in idea this is integrated and this is supposed to be the one stop for all command and control activities that are happening across the cities, what we noticed was that the transport services had their own integrated command control center. The police had its own integrated command and control center. Within the police, the city police had one, and the traffic police had one. The municipality had one. So it sort of defeated the idea of the integrated command and control center itself. And I think this is symptomatic of a larger problem within the government, where everyone has access to data. Everyone has a bunch of data that could help other people. Everyone makes decisions that affect the others, but um, each one is operating in its own silos and doesn't know what to do with the data. So I think so there is this need to rethink about participation within the government itself, so that the response can be a lot faster, and you don't have to have these task forces and committees created at the last minute, mobilizing support to do that. Um, it'll make putting in place reactive systems to contingencies like this a lot faster. And the second is participation between the civil society, the industry, and the government, which I think is something that we keep talking about, and to some limited degree we have achieved it in a couple of areas. But I think in terms of larger responses, I think there's a long way to go, because while we talk about participative decision making and things like that, and in rural areas, we have in pockets we have put in place social audit systems, and this whole gram sabha concept. I think that's something that's really missing in cities. In fact, if you go to most people don't know who their local representatives are. They might know who the MLA is, but they don't know who the corporator is, for instance. So and this kind of chaos in times like this lack of knowledge becomes a huge issue, because simply people don't know who to reach out to. The corporators don't know what the citizens want, and there is this lacuna in terms of or rather a vacuum that people are operating in. So again, this just contributes to increasing response time, and the damage overall that comes out of contingencies like this. The other, of course, the industry government participation is again something that has been, while yes, bodies like CII, ASSOCHAM, and FICCI do, regularly sort of interact with the government, there is also a huge gap in the level of interaction that many of our small MSMEs, micro entrepreneurs, and all of them who can't really weather the shock, they don't have that kind of access to the government. So while the big players in the industry might have it, we're actually seeing a situation where our MSMEs, who are large scale employment generators, who actually contribute in particularly in rural areas as the local distribution point, and for a lot of commodities, a lot of them may not be able to weather this crisis. And I think it's important that we start considering them and their needs as policymakers as well. And that's something that again brings me back to this whole strand of participation. So I think, yeah, these are the three sort of areas that I think need some thought and need some work from a policy point of view. And I'm hoping that over time, of course, a lot of this at the moment is sort of reactive and suppositional. A lot of it is my perspective, and as we go on, I think there'll be a lot more clarity on exactly what kind of areas need more attention than others. So I'm hoping to refine my thoughts a little bit more as we go along, but these are some starting points that I think we need to focus on. And finally, for the participation bit itself, one important strand that I missed was IEC. So I think Twila had mentioned about fake news and the impact that it can have, and how for a lot of people that is the only access to information. So I think the government, while there has been a lot of there's been a lot of initiatives, like, you know, even when you dial a phone number now, the first thing that you hear is you know, this warning about the coronavirus. But I think IEC as an activity is something that really needs to be ramped up, because unless citizens have information, it's going to contribute to panic. They're not going to be able to you know, fully participate in the way that they should. They're not going to be, for instance, if you don't know about social distancing norms, there's no way that you could actually you know, be cognizant and understand them and actually participate. So I think, again, over here there is a huge opportunity in terms of leveraging technology. I think we need to have bots in place to look at deepfakes. There is this technology that's coming out of Israel, if I'm not wrong, which can actually spot deepfakes and you know, warn people about it. So I think we really need to look at, one, increasing access to information, education and communication of citizens, and also look at curbing the impact of fake news, allowing people to know exactly what is real and what is credible. And I think, you know, over there's quite a bit of action to be done, and there are a couple of promising developments that I want to talk about. So one is in terms of participation, the government has been taking a lot of steps. So one is the Self for Society portal that MyGov has actually put up, which is kind of like a demand mapping thing, where as an individual or as an organization, as a contributor, you can actually say what you have to offer to the government, and then they will reach out to you and put you in touch with people who need it, or district administration that needs it. So, you know, when we leverage technology like that, each of us can actually be active contributors in mitigating the negative effects of something like this. But I think when that technology platforms like this and decisions like this should not be made in a reactive sort of way right after the pandemic has occurred, and it should be something that we plan for well in advance, because you know, a platform like Self for Society, for instance, has a lot of tangible value even in regular times, you know, not just in crises. So I think what really needs to be you know, considered is how we actually, not just the planning bit of it, but how we actually enforce and how we put together and stick to those plans, which is something I think has been really, really lacking from the public policy and governance point of view, in terms of our resilience and our ability to withstand such shocks. So yeah, I mean, highly unstructured thoughts, and hoping to, you know, refine these and as we go along. Thanks.
Thank you, Anirudh. I think that was really well thought out, and you know, I think we really do have to look at how different systems can be integrated within our city planning system, and how that can work its way into the development of a city, and also how technology can be leveraged in times of crisis. Yeah, so thank you so much for that. And I think Aishwarya is going to conclude before we move on to our question and answer session.
Yeah, actually, I mean, thank you. All the four speakers have actually addressed, or like sort of given us insights exactly how we were thinking while you're curating this panel. But I would just like to ask a small question, and perhaps we can go around the table for it. Conscious Cities movement is actually focused on making cities more responsive and aware to the needs and activities of its people. And that's how we sort of envision that a city can really be dynamic and adaptive to change, in the manner of speaking. And all four of you spoke about data, different kinds of data, right? So my question is pretty simple. Like, at what point do we have to sort of create a balance between indicators and objective and third-person data, and then go back to, say, subjective data or first-person data, and sort of use that to create or even enforce a certain feedback loop? Because at the end of the day, the way we collect data, the kind of data it is, also sort of guides the narrative when it comes to simulation, modeling, and eventually, of course, theorizing and even applying those systems in design. So if all four of you could sort of pitch into this particular question, then we can sort of move on to the audience questions as well. I hope I was heard. I hope my internet did not betray me while I was talking.
No, we heard you. We heard you well.
We could start with the eyes in the sky and the human geographer's perspective. Professor Batty, you could take a shot at it. And then probably from you, we can move to Jwala in the end, because she's literally the one who works with people and as subjective data can get, I guess.
Okay, well, let me try and address the sort of question generally about, well, relatively objective versus subjective kind of impressions and reflected in data. I think one of our problems in thinking about cities is that as sort of society has changed over the last 200 years, 250 years since the Industrial Revolution, really, more and more technologies have come to be used in cities, and this has actually made cities much more complicated to understand, more complex to understand than at any time in the past. So consequently, we're kind of running to stand still in terms of making sense of how cities function, really, in that context. And there are many new types of behavior, if you like, in cities that we're getting some data about, but never enough, of course. And they're reflecting changes in human behavior. So to some extent, although we are in the era of big data where sensors and computers are able to generate data for us in some sense. I mean, our own mobile phones are the ultimate sensor to some extent, and the data associated with that is absolutely enormous. I mean, we're creating more data ourselves than any other form of information technology, just by our use of phones for a whole variety of things, you know, searching for information, you know, talking to friends on social media and so on. So we have all this data. Making sense of it is very problematic. Actually getting it in a suitable form is quite problematic. But none of the data necessarily answers the questions that we might want to ask. So for example, we have some very good data sets from Transport for London in London on movements of passengers. So we use smart cards, we use the Oyster card on the buses and the trains, and all of that data is captured where you tap in and you tap out. We have all that data. But the problem is that that data doesn't tell us where people live, doesn't tell us where people work, doesn't tell us why people are doing anything. It's very difficult to add to the data because of confidentiality, that it's pretty vanilla data set. And therefore, the kind of human behavior we can get from that is very limited. It's not useless in some sense, but it's pretty limited. And I think this is true of much of the data that we now have about the city. For example, this pandemic, where we're all locking down, and basically in the UK, I'm sure this is true in India, essential workers have been identified and they are allowed, in quotes, to go to work, basically, in this sense. So we have some sense of the disruption to travel patterns, which is absolutely enormous in some senses. It's very difficult to predict what will happen when people gradually begin to go back to work. That much depends on the exit strategy. But what I'm really saying here is that we have a lot of data about the city, an increasing amount, but the city is ever more complicated, ever more complex, if you like, in that sense. So we're running to stand still. That's the first point. And then you raised the point about subjective data. How do we, I mean, there's a whole question of the subjective responses of individuals in cities and everywhere else for that matter, with respect to their own behavior in that particular context, that the behavior is not necessarily immediately rational in the economic sense necessarily. It's explicable, it may be rational in the wider sense, but it's quite problematic. So, and much of this is subjective, our responses are subjective. So, in some senses, we face a this is even before the pandemic. We face an enormous crisis of understanding when it comes to cities in this particular context. And so, I mean, it's a rather dismal message in some senses. Layer the pandemic on top of that, then it becomes really quite problematic to know how to proceed in some senses. So my own view about this is we need better theories about how cities work to some extent. We won't get those until we get good data about what people are doing. And even then, because cities are composed of individuals and individuals are self-determining, you know, they're rational in and of their own sense, we can never really predict what somebody is going to do tomorrow, basically, in that sense. So we have some problems of prediction. Now, none of these issues I've raised are any different for cities than they are for society at large in that sense. Now, I'm not quite sure I've answered your question, but I've just kind of muddied the waters a bit more in some senses. And it's not that my answer is not really related to the pandemic per se, although obviously the pandemic gives us a chance to pause and actually reflect how little we know in that context. I'll hand on to somebody else.
Thank you. Maybe Jwala, you could talk about the subjective data, and maybe after that, Anup sir, you could talk about what kind of data would really help in when it comes to planning and design, like quickly, and then Anu can sort of rebut that because he seems to have a lot of knowledge about what the government can generate in terms of data. So, if need be, Jwala, you're muted. We can't hear you. We cannot hear you.
Sorry. So I think even though it's subjective and it's with people, I think what Professor Batty sort of pointed out is it's quite similar. You know, I think it's for a pandemic like this, or for situations that come up, you can never really be fully prepared. But what I feel is education and knowledge is extremely important, and that needs to go across to people. So the WHO knew exactly what to do. We had all the, wash your hands, sneeze into your sleeve, and everything coming up. So everyone knew what needed to be done in a pandemic. But I think where it was lacking was it didn't go out to the masses. And that's why I feel it has to be part of education. And there has to be some protocol. And then we just try and work through the situation when we have it. But there has to be some protocol that's laid down.
Okay. Thank you. So,
yeah. So I feel data itself manifests in multiple forms, and that's what's quite critical for us today to start reading it, because any data today might be a sociologist will read that data differently, a transport planner will read it differently, somebody with finance will read it differently, a doctor will read that data differently. But the challenge for us today is that there should be some sense of uniform data, which is common. I think that is really fundamental. It's not that we've not done that. What if you go and ask for a loan today, just in a bank, and imagine that guy will again tell you in the next 10 minutes that you applied for a loan in 10 other places. It's not that the data is not available. It is just that the way the data is narrated and the way it is consumed is the problem. And I'm saying we've had great sources of data. If you take Aadhaar for a case, that is, I'm saying that is such a huge amount of data about people and about the city itself, which is available. Now, minus all that, what does this data need to do? It actually kind of links back to resilient systems. But if you place these resilient systems, the data for me should be reflective. At some point, it should be very powerfully reflective. I should be able to look at it from a resource point of view, because that's the biggest point of resource I have from actually creating various aspects of generators of scenarios. It should be inclusive. Most often what happened today, data, in fact, that's what Jwala was also talking about earlier, is that if it's not inclusive, you still have a problem. It needs to be completely inclusive. And what it does is that once it's inclusive, then it becomes easier to integrate it. Then you have an integrated system which comes into it. Work in a way that it is robust, because if you don't put the robustness behind it, then at some point of time, it is not going to be used right. You might actually misappropriate this data completely. Create redundancy in this, because usually what happens is that if there is a collapse of this data, and there's again deep trouble, which is that. So create enough redundancy so that this data is secure, it can be used effectively. Make it flexible, because that's also critical to how, when the data is available for you, to the amount of flexibility which offers to you. Somebody was joking with me the other day. He said, you all guys speak about big data and all of that. Finally, am I a binary as a human being, right, in that entire system? Or am I like a little pixel in that thing? But people don't understand that all these binaries actually start making a big impact when we start reading the whole picture. And it's our responsibility, even if at the binary level we are contributing into that data, that is effective data. So that's, I feel, is very, very critical in the way we look at big data. I think there's no way out than reading cities from that point going forward.
Thank you so much.
So I just wanted to ask you, just because of what you said, is it possible to be inclusive in cities like India where the population is just overwhelming? Can we have inclusive data? Is that possible? And how do we go about that if we want to do it even in Bangalore, perhaps?
I'm just giving you a simple case example. Go and ask a banker loan today. Doesn't matter who you are. He'll have granular data telling you whether you're a defaulter, whether you're able to pay him or not pay him. It's not that it is not there. It is just that this data source has to be clear. It has to be defined very, very specifically. And you should make it inclusive. And I'm sure that a lot of you have seen it in the last few days of how, when people are going into certain areas of the city seeking data reference points, they're shooed away. They're asked to leave the place, right? So sometimes we have to behave like that binary. If we don't take responsibility at the binary level, I think we've failed in creating this big data. And this is for everybody. Finally, it is. Tomorrow, if I have to make a good transport plan, I need to know exactly the number of people getting in and getting out. We make all our plans. Look at the metro station today. Somebody will tell you there is a 60,000 footfall in a specific metro station. It is designed for that, assuming that there is some data available which is accurate. So that's I think that's the beauty of why we need this. I'm saying, yeah, this is like, yeah, we just need it right, this whole thing, and need to be done really absolutely specifically and precisely.
Right. There's a very technical question for Professor Batty, as former student. Maybe you could just pitch that. I think there in one of the chats. Professor, are you able to answer the chat?
I saw that. Professor, the question is from, should I read it out?
Yeah, just read it out.
Yeah, okay. Okay, 1 second. How do we estimate parameters while modeling a parametric using, what is that? CA, cellular automata, which are the limitations of using a susceptible, infected, recovered SIR model in modeling a pandemic such as the COVID-19?
Right, okay. Now, I think that question probably relates to the fact that I wrote a paper about 20 years ago on modeling urban growth as a kind of pandemic, in some sense, where we use the framework of the model, which divides the world up into, divides the population up into infectives and susceptibles and those who recover. So we start off with a population, we introduce some infection, and then the rest of the population are susceptible, they get infected, some of them recover, and eventually everybody recovers in some sense. And these are essentially the models that are used to predict the dynamics of a pandemic. Now, what I did was to take that analogy, take that idea, and think about the development of urban growth, where you had the susceptible being the land which you think you can grow the city on, The seed are the infective, being the growth itself. So you see growth growing across land. And then once the city became mature, the infectives, you could say they recovered. And that was a little bit like, you know, once the development gets developed, basically, it sort of goes into the recovery category. And so we looked at that, and the way we modeled the growth was using these techniques called cellular automata. That model has nothing at all really to do with the idea of pandemics that we're talking about, other than the fact that it's simply a growth process. If you think of a pandemic as a growth process, then there are many growth processes. The obvious growth process is exponential growth, where things just grow in proportion to one another, and it continues to grow. Normally, exponential growth begins to tail off at some point, and it becomes logistic growth. So you get the classic S-shaped curve of growth, basically. Now, most of the pandemic models that we have are variations on this general theme in that sense. So rapid growth and contagion is really the essence of these sorts of models. And what we were doing in terms of urban growth, we were beginning to think of it in those terms. Now, I think that's what the questioner probably is getting at in some sense. Whether we can relate this to public health infections, the biology of these infections that we have at the moment, a good example might be that if a good example of this, of course, could be made spatial in the following sense, that if, for example, a town gets infected, or people in a town get infected, then the population will spread through contact, in their sense, and they'll gradually spread, so that and of course the infection basically is person to person. I know that in the case of coronavirus, you get infections that remain on surfaces. So somebody doesn't need to touch and doesn't need to be in contact with another human to actually get the disease. You can actually pick it up simply by being in an environment where the virus has actually is located on surfaces and so on. You can pick it up that way. It actually decays quite rapidly in that sense. It's more likely you're going to pick it up through droplets coming out of somebody's somebody in that sense. But nevertheless, this process can be spatial. If it starts off in a certain place and then it begins to grow, it grows through the town. So you could sort of see, if it began in the center of town, then you could probably plot it and see it growing outwards towards the suburbs, because they're further away and it's more difficult to contact in that sense. And you can see that in terms of Italy, well, you can see it in terms of Wuhan, for example, because it started in Wuhan and it grew very rapidly in Wuhan city and into the province, which Hubei, which Wuhan is in. But then also because of connectivity, flights and so on, people flew to Beijing and Shanghai and so on. In fact, I think there was some incredible statistic that said that, you know, in one day, 10,000 people, this is the height of the epidemic really, 10,000 people had flown out of Wuhan, had flown in and out of Wuhan, basically. That's before they closed the airport and everything like that. And you can see that the numbers of people traveling, and this is the global connectivity thing, is enormous. Now, the model that I talked about with cellular automata is really very localized, and it relates to how a town might spread. But you could think of it in terms of a country. You could think of the big cities beginning to spread in some sense, and then the smaller cities, which are more remote, through contact over time, begin to get the virus. So in that context, you could build what's called the cellular automata model. Basically, that's there's nothing magical about that. You just divide the world up into different areas of cities, zones, if you like, which are called cells, basically, like a pixel grid, you know, in that sense. So I think that's my immediate response to the questioner.
Thank you. I think.
Thank you.
The question was answered in quite a lot of detail. I think the person who asked the question might be quite satisfied at the moment. There's one more. How are we doing for time? I think we exceeded that time quite a bit. Do we have 10 more minutes? 5 more minutes? How are we doing for time, panelists? So,
Sure.
Anup sir, Professor Badi.
Yeah, fine.
Do we have 10 minutes? Okay.
Okay.
All right. So there's a question for Anup sir, and it's from Trishal Kumar. He talks about how cities being spread out probably comes from severe feasibility issues in countries as dense as Netherlands, India, and China, etc. Are there any practices like those that Bangalore had to adopt back in 1890s in terms of city design? Do you have any particular comment on that, sir?
Yeah, we've seen that, and as I mentioned earlier, that most often cities got planned because of the diseases. So I think that's the reality of Bangalore too. So when Bangalore was hit by plague, two new localities were formed, Malleshwaram and Baswangudi. And in fact, what's interesting from a policy point of view, there were very interesting regulations which were written on management, controls, building design, building controls, services designs, and it is outstanding. I think from what they learned and how they wanted to look at from a preventive point of view, it's a possibility, and I'm sure that today with your environmental health and safety mandates, which are now, if you should look at it, a city in that format, that you should have your EHS standards for cities, and most often this will vary from one city to another because of various parameters which will get the hygiene parameters will be different. But at least at a minimum operation level, I think every city today going forward should have a very clear-cut EHS standard. And that will help a lot, because then you're measured against something, right? Today we don't have a yardstick to measure. Today, and it's a very situational thing today. What was done for Malleshwaram, and if you look at how Malleshwaram again is changing today, those old standards will not fit into, because it's getting densified. It's getting to be per plot, the number of people using it is much more. So sometimes you'll find that your infrastructure is under phenomenal stress. You need to look at going back and providing for new infrastructure. So that's a cyclical aspect of things. But just as very clear-cut mandates, I think today's cities should have their own environmental health and safety mandates very clearly drafted. It should be regulated. It should be something which is written in the bylaw today. Yeah, it's good to follow baselines, what probably a WHO or one of these guidelines give you, but I think it's important because coastal towns have different mandates. Plateau-based towns have different mandates. Water-bound cities have different sets of mandates. So I think it's good that now, as part of the urban planning, urban design process, we start mandating EHS standards for cities.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Do we have questions?
I have a
Padmishri,
question, actually, that's okay.
Oh, sure, of course. I mean, if any of you
This
have
is
questions
to,
for
Anup or Professor Bati, just I was wondering, in the current scenario, say we have a slum like Dharavi, or we have New York, or even London for that matter, is there anything that can be done right away? Because obviously the lockdown and the social distancing doesn't quite work so well in such highly dense populated places. And, like say something like a place like Dharavi, social distancing is almost impossible, and a lockdown is probably giving a bigger risk of spreading the condition if someone did have COVID. So what would be a solution for a situation like this?
I mean,
well, it's quite difficult. But normally the lockdown, I think the idea of a lockdown is a last resort in some sense. That originally Germany, for example, and South Korea appear to have taken a combination of lockdown and lockdown is a very blunt instrument, I'm saying. But the idea of tracing contacts, which is incredibly difficult to do and to be comprehensive, but the idea that if you are infected and you infect others, that you trace those contacts quickly and basically isolate them in some sense, that actually stops the virus transmission much better than the sort of blanket or blunt form of lockdown that we have here in the UK, which is not super effective because the police are basically told to be gentle in terms of the lockdown, in terms of people staying at home and so on. So it's very leaky is the lockdown. The problem with the other method, the contact tracing, is it's incredibly exhaustive in terms of the numbers of people you would have to have involved in the contact tracing in that sense. And almost if you don't have a system in place to begin with very early on, then you've got problems that the epidemic becomes too great to be able to do that contact tracing. Now, apparently South Korea have done it quite successfully, and so indeed have Germany. Germany is a very interesting case. And a lot of it relates to testing. One of the big things in the UK at the moment is this question of testing, that we don't test enough people. And that's largely because that in Britain, certainly, and certainly in America, I think, and France and so on, Spain, Italy, we just didn't have enough kit, basically. We didn't have enough tests, basically, in a sense. It's as simple as that, a resource thing. Because nobody expected this pandemic to develop in the way it did. I mean, I even remember, I remember it really was quite problematic. Even that's my phone. My wife's got to answer it. Don't worry. So he's answered it. Anyway, the problem I think in every country is that we get it. We don't realise the severity of it because we have no real experience of it. We can read about what happened in 1918 and that kind of thing, but we don't really have any experience of this very rapid exponential growth over a matter of days. And we don't realize how virulent it is, that this virus is very virulent compared to other viruses, compared to flu, for example, I think, in that sense. And so consequently, we've not had enough time to respond in that sense. The biggest issue, I think, is you're absolutely right, that self-isolation is problematic. It's very leaky. And of course, it can't go on forever because there is a big economic question hanging over all of this too. It can't go on forever. At some point it has to stop or change. And that is equally problematic if you isolate certain age groups or if you isolate certain areas. So if you take somewhere like Manhattan, for example, New York, then I'm sure that the virus varies quite generally over the whole metropolitan area. But you can't really take a little bit of the metropolitan area and isolate it in that sense. There's just too many leaks, really. So the biggest question I think we're all facing at the moment is what happens after a period of lockdown, a period of isolation in that sense. It's extremely problematic. We don't have any experience of it really in that sense.
Right. Are there any more questions? I don't think so.
There's one from Kaushik.
I think we can just email the questions to the panelists and we can.
Yeah, I think so.
Later time.
Salila had a question.
Yeah, we did. We answered that. Yeah, I mean, it went on. Okay. Right. Thank you so much, all of you guys, for contributing. It was a brilliant discussion. It was really, it went from a broad philosophical and even a political discussion to a very technical level of actually implementing and even thinking about the kind of changes that we might have to discuss in the coming times. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day ahead. And we'll keep you posted about what we do with the report. And when we publish the videos, we'll send it across to you so that if you want things edited out, maybe we might be able to accommodate such requests as well. So anyway, have a nice day.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
and,
have a nice day. Thank you.
Yeah, be safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for all
Bye.
attending.
No problem.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so
certainly.
much.
Thank
Yeah.
for
Bye,
being
everybody.
on.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.